Hello, friends. Hey, Mike Falkenstine here with 1-8 Catalyst and one of the co-hosts of our Facebook Live show, Missions Talk. I'm here again with Steve Schirmer. And Steve, you've said something about a tornado watch there. Is everyone okay there in South Carolina?
Yeah, so we're fine. We're under tornado watch. Past couple of years, we've had a couple of tornadoes.
Oh,
And
yeah.
my face is just a tad blurry, and I'm sorry, I just don't know how to fix it. I've been trying, and
No, it looks great.
just going to be, it's not as clear as Mike. Mike is like crystal clear, like looking at a diamond.
Wow, isn't that weird? That's weird. Well, and you don't want to goof around with those tornadoes, Steve. So keep an eye on that while we record this episode.
I have my radar right here.
Okay, good. You got that going. Good. Well, Steve, I'm really excited about this episode. You know, I think it was you who had actually found out about today's guest. So Danny Lamastra is an author and also a person serving overseas. And so we want to give him the opportunity to introduce himself. But Steve, I think you had found out about his book, Pursuing the Call, and it kind of sparked your interest, I think, didn't it?
Yeah, so he reached out, and I'm actually in the process of looking for written resources that we can give our future missionaries to work through. We've got the book I've written about having legitimacy on the mission field, and then Danny reached out. I'll see if I can get it in the camera here. His book, Pursuing the Call.
Oh, great!
So he sent it to me to review. So yeah, we're excited to have him on here to hear what he has to say, why he wrote the book, things like that. So it should be good.
Yeah. So Danny, thank you so much for joining us. And tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're coming from today, and, where you're serving, who you're serving with, all that. Give us a quick introduction to you and what you're doing.
Yes. So I am in El Salvador. I've been living in El Salvador for the past 4 years. I came here initially to work in prison ministry. And during the pandemic, there were some changes in kind of my role in ministry, and I'm now doing something else. Since the pandemic started, the visitation access to be able to go into the prisons and do the programs that we had been doing beforehand really shut down completely. And unfortunately, we were never able to fully get back up and running in that area. And so for the past year, approximately, I've been a teacher at a Christian school here in El Salvador and still serving here in El Salvador. And that's been my journey so far.
Oh, great. And where are you from originally?
I'm originally from New Jersey, and I studied at Southeastern University in Florida. So I lived in Florida for 5 years as well.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's great. That's great. So originally from New Jersey, by way of Florida, now in El Salvador.
Keep going south.
That's really great. So give us just quickly, before we get to your book itself, give us a little bit of your journey towards like how you actually became a missionary serving on the field. Give us kind of the quick 2 or 3 minute, hey, this is what God did to get me there.
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home. The church that I was involved with pretty much my whole life was very, very big on missions. They had lots of missionaries that were always coming through and speaking at church. And so I was aware of the concept of missions from a really young age. And as I was getting to the point of determining where I wanted to go to college and what I wanted to do with my life and things like that, I really started to consider seriously the possibility of doing something missions related. And so I decided to go to a Christian college because of that. Like I said, I ended up going to Southeastern University in Florida. And during my time there were 2 experiences for me that I would say were very key in pushing me to the point that I actually did become a full-time missionary after graduation. The first experience for me was the opportunity to volunteer at a local urban mission center that was in the community. and being able to have a role in ministry that was missions focused, even though it was local, was a really great experience. You know, a lot of people, when they are graduating and they go and they get hired at a church as youth pastor or something like that, that's the first time that they've ever had like a leadership role in ministry. And so for me, like the opportunity to have a leadership role in ministry before graduation was huge for me in terms of developing the desires that I had to become a missionary, and in terms of helping me learn more about what is involved in actual day-to-day ministry in a real life scenario, not just in the classroom. So that was the one experience. And the other experience that was big for me was I was a Spanish minor. And so that really opened up my eyes to this part of the world where I'm now living, Latin America.
I bet.
It gave me more of a desire to explore the possibility of doing something outside the United States. Because initially, when I first started college, my sights were set more so on doing ministry in the U.S. than doing something international. But the Spanish minor was really what pushed me in the direction of exploring international missions as a possibility.
Okay, great. Well, you know, I love that because that's what God does a lot of times, right? You begin learning a language, and it really does open up, your eyes and your heart towards people. I mean, of course, Danny, you don't know this, but both Steve and I have kind of a heritage and a history in China. And so it was really when I started doing Chinese language study originally that, you just begin to understand more about the people, their culture. I mean, it's so all that's tied to, their history, all that's tied to their language, isn't it? So that's really great to hear. So Steve, I saw you have a copy of his book, right? Have you had a chance to peruse it?
There it goes. It's actually clearer than my face. Anyways, yeah. So I have been scanning it.
Great.
I really do like stories when I hear what was the trigger that got someone to pursue a missionary calling, to pursue
me too.
Going abroad. I mean, for me, it wasn't so much the steps like that you went through that got me going, but it was actually meeting someone in China. That's a different story I won't get into, but it was one conversation I had that triggered everything for me. But anyways, so we're here about your book. Right here. Pursuing the Call. Practical Guide for New and Prospective Missionaries. So everyone has a moment, like when I had my moment about writing my book, the moment that Mike has had writing his. What was the moment where you realized, even with all the books out there, why this one?
Yeah, so I think the pandemic actually was a big part of the reason why I ended up writing the book. Without the pandemic, I don't know that it ever would have been written. Here in El Salvador, the initial stages of the pandemic had a lot of restrictions that went into place. And there was about a 2-month period where the country was on full lockdown. You couldn't leave your house. The last number of your ID is what determined what days you are allowed to go to the supermarket. Other than that, you had to stay in your home. There were military circulating the streets. Anybody that was out and about whose ID did not correspond to the day was being arrested and held indefinitely without trial. And so it shut us down completely. Like all of the stuff we were doing in ministry was completely out the window. A lot of people started trying to do stuff with Zoom and things like that. But in our case, with the prison ministry, the prisons did not have initially the technological capacity to be able to do anything virtual whatsoever. And so I was sitting at home, unable to go anywhere, completely bored, and trying to figure out what to do with my time. And my mom actually was the one, we were talking in the first week or so about the pandemic and the restrictions and whatnot. And she mentioned, hey, have you ever thought about writing a book? And I was like, no, I haven't. But, after about a week of just sitting around doing nothing, the idea of doing something productive didn't sound so bad. So that was kind of what pushed me to write the book, that circumstance. As far as the topic and what I actually ended up putting into the book. I had read a lot about missions before becoming a missionary, like I think most missionaries probably do. I had studied missions courses in college, going to a Christian school. I did a master's degree in ministry as well. And so in terms of like reading about missions, I had read a ton of stuff. But when I actually got to El Salvador and was a brand new missionary, those first 6 months, I felt like there was a lot that I was not prepared for. And so the goal for me was, while all of those things were still fresh in my mind, because it was relatively close to the beginning of my time as a missionary that I wrote the book, the idea was put a book together that contains all of those pieces of practical advice that I felt like I had not received in the books that I'd read. And that's not to say that nothing that I talk about is discussed in any other book, because there is some overlap. But the goal was to put together what are the holes that I felt like I didn't have for me when I was reading about missions that I think could be helpful for other people.
That's great.
So, I'm looking at the table of contents. I mean, you go from preparing to choosing how you're going to go, the sending structure, the financial, the language, the culture shock. That's something I think a lot of people, I don't think, are really prepared for, the culture shock. I can tell you I wasn't. Beyond culture shock, personal spiritual health, chapter 9, final logistical preparations. I think it's I think it's a great, it's only 138 pages. It's not long, but it's enough information to give you a good idea of what you're walking into. Even though a lot of people are still going through training, I had a friend that went to China, and he would tell me, he went through 6 weeks of training with his organization. Wow. But he would say by the time he got there, he remembered 10% of it.
Oh, right.
And he had to learn the other 90%, on the fly as he was doing it. So, to have a resource you can read, but also refer back to, I think is really handy. What do you think, Mike?
Yeah, no, I agree. In fact, I was just thinking, guys, that, so let's say your organization is providing that kind of training or any kind of training at all. There's almost, in my mind, there's almost not enough training, that you could do. So going through your organization's training and then to have this book resource as kind of a, another source of information. And whatever you can learn about, the importance of learning language and surviving culture shock and, your spiritual, health, your personal spiritual health. These chapter titles are critical, right? So Danny, I'm wondering, as I look at your 9 chapters, what have you found in your own journey, and now as you're talking to people about the book that are if you were to take your chapter titles, kind of these main bigger topics that you're writing about, what are the 2 or 3 topics that you're finding are the hardest for someone that's going on to the missions field?
Yeah, so I think that the 3 most challenging are probably the chapter on finances, the chapter on culture shock, and the chapter on personal spiritual health. Finances, starting from the beginning there, is a topic that really nobody enjoys dealing with.
Right.
Normally, not all missions organizations are structured like this, but the majority require the missionary to do some level of fundraising. And usually that means you have to raise all of your support. So personal support, ministry funds, all of it. And that can be a very intimidating task for a lot of people. It was a very intimidating task for me, for sure. And I've really spun my wheels for the first 6 months without really making hardly any progress at all in terms of chipping away at the budget before the chip started to click and I started to actually, have some success. So I think that's something that's hard. culture shock is hard because there's no way to really fully prepare for it. Like I studied culture a lot. I had studied the language. I had engulfed myself in Hispanic organizations in the United States. Like I thought that I had done everything that I could to mitigate culture shock. And even so, the first 6 months or so of being here was full-blown culture shock. And so that's something that I think, even if you read the book, like I'm not making any promises that you're not going to go through culture shock, but hopefully it can help you process a little bit more health. And then in terms of personal spiritual health, that was probably the hardest chapter to write, in all honesty. But I think that's probably the most important. If I had to choose just one, that would have been the one. Because it's very easy when you're in ministry to neglect your own relationship with God. It's very easy to justify not spending time reading the Bible because you've prepared 3 Bible studies and a sermon that week and you were studying the Bible for that. You know, it's very easy to just burn out because you're just moving a million miles an hour doing ministry and you don't realize the toll that it's taking on you personally. And the reality is that if you're serious about wanting to help people, you have to prioritize making sure that you are in an emotional, mental, spiritually healthy state that's going to enable you to have something to offer to people.
That's right.
So that for me is probably the most important chapter of the book.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, you can't give to anyone something you don't already have, right? Yeah. I mean, if you're not growing spiritually, you're not going to be able to help people grow spiritually for sure. So, yeah, I love that. That's good. And so just a quick side question, Danny, the chapter on raising financial support, are you giving kind of a step-by-step how to raise the support, or is this more, no, you definitely need to do this, you need to prioritize it, just making it, are you giving any kind of step-by-step on how missionaries can be raising support?
Yeah, I try to make it as practical as possible. So there is some introductory information at the beginning of the chapter about the theological legitimacy of support raising. But from that point forward, it's mostly practical steps, things that you could do that will accelerate your support raising process. And what are like best practices for raising support in a way that's sustainable, because you want to make sure that support stays coming in after you're in the mission field too.
Right.
So basically best practices for raising support in practical steps. That's kind of the heart of that chapter.
Okay. That's great. Okay, good. Well, yeah, that sounds great because, yeah, any kind of help they can get in that area as well is good. So, Steve, of course, we always love to give, encouragement to people, right? So I think you wanted to ask Danny a question about that.
Yeah, before I do that, I just want to emphasize the personal spiritual health chapter that he mentioned.
Ooh, yeah. Definitely.
I was just talking with a pastor from mainland China yesterday, and, some of our conversation got onto some of his struggles. And so I was, getting into an area of just trying to encourage him about taking a day off every week, being intentional. But I mean, it's just not just having a Sabbath day. There's so much about personal spiritual health. So I would definitely agree. I think that, in my experience, is probably the one I was weakest on and still can be at times. But also I think that's the one I find most cross-cultural workers are weakest on, because they're so passionate about giving and serving the people they're there to serve that they forget that if they don't invest in themselves or let others invest in them, eventually they're going to run out of gas.
That's right.
I mean, Mike and I have talked quite a bit in the past anyways about burnout, things like that. So yeah, I would agree with that. So I just wanted to say that as it was on my mind.
Yeah.
But
thank you.
So encouragement. So what would you, if you were to meet a new missionary, a prospective missionary, or I guess you could include anyone even over there. How would you encourage them in terms of going, in terms of sustaining themselves, things like that?
Yeah. So the biggest thing that I would say, this is actually something that's not in the book, but if I ever come out with a second edition, I'd probably include it, is don't let yourself get discouraged by unmet expectations. The reason I say that is because when somebody's going into missions, it is normal, I think, for them to have a certain expectation in their mind of what missions is going to be like. And what I have found in my own experience and with other people that I've talked to who have been down this road as well, is that initial expectation of what you think missions is going to be like usually doesn't line up with what missions is actually like when you actually get to the mission field and are actually doing ministry. And if you allow those unmet expectations to discourage you, it can really train wreck you really quickly. Because there's two different ways that people tend to process that. The first is that people can start to get mad at God and feel like God has let them down because their expectations weren't met. Or the alternative, the other way, is that people can think, I'm just not cut out for this. Like, this isn't what I thought it was going to be. I guess that I'm just not supposed to be a missionary. And they feel like a failure, right? And really, it's not either one of those things. It's not that God failed you, and it's not that you're a failure either. It's just that there was a disconnect between your expectations and the reality of your experience. And in Luke 24, there's a story that I think speaks to this very, very well. It's the story of when Jesus encountered two of his followers on the road to Emmaus shortly after his resurrection. Luke's the only one that of the four Gospels that includes this story. And he doesn't give us a lot of information about the two guys that were on the road to Emmaus. But what we do know is that they weren't part of the 12 disciples, but they were pretty close to the inner circle, because in the passage, we see that they interact with the 12 disciples. They know exactly where to find them. And so they were people that were close to Jesus, even though they weren't part of the 12. And it's interesting that they're going where they're going, because the rest of Jesus's core group of disciples, all of the ones that are recorded, at least in the Bible, they're all in Jerusalem, right? Every single one of them are in Jerusalem. But these guys are going to a city that, by ancient traveling standards, without cars and stuff like that, is not a nearby place. It's not somewhere that they can just go run a quick errand and then be back by nighttime. It would appear that they are abandoning ship, that they're done. And when Jesus is talking to them, we find out the reason why they're done. And it's in verse 21, if you're looking at the passage in Luke 24. But they say, we had hoped that he would redeem Israel, talking about Jesus. In fact, in the Spanish, that could actually even be translated, we had expected that he was the one that was going to redeem Israel. And because their expectation wasn't met, that's the reason why they were going now in a totally different direction with their lives. And what's interesting is that their expectation not being met was such a big stumbling block for them, that it says in the passage that they didn't even recognize Jesus. He's with them for hours, but the text says that they were kept from recognizing him. And I think in that passage, we really end up seeing the danger of what can happen if we don't process unmet expectations correctly. The reality for them was that God hadn't failed them. God's plan was still very much so in motion. In fact, it was much greater than even what they had expected it to be. Right? But the reality was just that their expectations that they had kind of devised on their own, that they had kind of attributed to being God's plan, it was misaligned, right? And so if Jesus doesn't meet them on the road, who knows what ends up happening to them. And so it's very important, I think, for us as missionaries and people in general, to be very careful about that, to hold our calling and our ministry loosely enough that if God shifts our direction and we need to pivot, we can pivot. It doesn't shatter us completely.
That's right.
And so that would be, I think, for me recently, like over the past couple months especially, that's been like a big theme for me of what would I say to people who are going into ministry. Because during the course of the pandemic, there's been, I think, unmet expectations for everybody, right? Everybody had plans that they had for ministry that got completely upended and derailed. And over the last 2 years, just in the circle of people that have been influential to me personally, I've seen more people fall away from the faith over the last couple of years than probably the rest of my life combined. And so I just really think that that's an important message for people to consider that are going into ministry.
Thank you,
Danny,
for that.
I think you hit the nail on the head.
Definitely.
I think the expectation is something we often go, especially from America. We go with these expectations of ministry. There's people who go out there with these expectations of planting exponential number of churches just because they heard something in a conference about how to plant churches and they saw these amazing reports and now they're going out with the same idea. I've come across a number of people like that, and then they end up being discouraged because it didn't work for them. And even before I left for China, I had a pastor from China tell me, you're as an American, you're going to go out with this expectation of what you're going to do, but you're going to realize in a couple of years that what you thought you were going to do is not what you're going to do. And you really need to go. And even while I was living there, and I still remember this example, this missionary friend, we were sitting at a coffee shop and he's like, sometimes we just come to the field with our hands like this, that God, I'm going to do this. And we never give God the ability to move things and add things to our life. But if we go with our hands like this, if I can even get it in the screen, even if we have a plan there, but it's loosely held rather than tightly gripped. And so we need I think you're right. And the pandemic, I hope, taught us a lot of things. And I would definitely agree that was one of them. We all had expectations in 2020 and everything failed.
And in 2022.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly.
And Steve, how many episodes have we done about essentially that topic? We've done a number about how COVID has changed every different facet of ministry. And there isn't a ministry that it hasn't affected, and expectations have been totally changed, right? There's not any of us that were immune to to those changes. So, Danny, I was just going to add to what Steve said, and because as I was hearing you talk, I also thought about, I'm a real history buff, and so I love this story of William Carey, who first initially went to India, and it was 7 years before William Carey saw his first convert to Christ upon landing in India. And I just often think that actually it's a story that I often just remember just because you think about it, you've just raised this money, you've all this, especially in the 1800s, what it took to get there, whatever that was, a couple months to get there or a month to get there. And, just a lot of effort, and to not have anyone except Christ for 7 years. I'm sure he's in passing 6 years of, his ministry there and just thinking, Lord, what are you doing? Oh my gosh. So yeah, it's just, and it turned out he had throughout the course of his entire ministry there, many came to Christ, but just for those early years, you can imagine, how many times potentially he was thinking about going home, and, so yeah, just managing the expectations. And I guess I would add in, even playing off the title of your book, Pursuing the Call, if you've pursued it and God has called you to it, just sort of remaining in that call and, just trusting that, that was actually God, and he's got some plans, and sometimes it takes a while for us to be able to, to see him in what he wanted to do. So, Danny, as we end the episode, 2 quick questions for you. Number one, do you have any final thoughts for people that are watching, maybe some folks that are pursuing a call that they feel? You have any just quick encouragement or any final thoughts for them?
Yeah, so the final thought, and this is something that I close out the book with, is after you read through all of the different aspects of becoming a missionary, it's very easy to feel overwhelmed, right? But keep going, no matter like what obstacles present themselves. Don't take an obstacle as automatically meaning that you're not qualified or that God doesn't want you to do missions. Push through the obstacles, because there will be obstacles. But if you keep going, you're going to have an incredible experience waiting for you on the other side that you'll remember for the rest of your life.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I would just really agree with that. And then finally, I know the book is available on Amazon. Do you want to give any kind of, here's where else the book is available? Obviously, we always want to give you a chance to connect with the audience. If they want to contact you directly, what are the best ways for them to do that?
Yeah, so I don't have a huge social media presence, unfortunately, but my contact info is actually on the publisher's website, necopress.com. They have my email address on there with the book info, I believe. So if anybody wants to contact me, they can do that. And as far as where the book's available, Amazon, obviously, you already mentioned, is where most people buy. It's on all major outlets, Barnes & Noble's, Target. But I would also add that the publisher's website has a cheaper price than anywhere else.
Really?
It's $5 cheaper on the publisher's website than I believe the list price on Amazon, because Amazon takes their cut from everything.
Oh, right.
So if you already bought it from Amazon, I'm sorry. But if you haven't bought it yet, if you're watching this, if you want to buy a copy, the publisher website is the cheapest place to get it, necopress.com.
Okay. Thank you so much. Steve, any final thoughts and wrap-up thoughts from you?
No, I mean, Danny, I appreciate you coming on. This is really interesting. You've been a missionary for 4 years?
Yeah, coming up on 4 years in June, actually. So just about 4 years together.
So in 4 years, that's a lot of wisdom to come up with. It really to take all those experiences, research with other people. So yeah, I mean, you could see that God's definitely giving you some insight to be able to gather this information, to produce another resource to help missionaries. So yeah, it's going to be exciting to see what else you publish in the future. If you decide, maybe your mother needs to keep hounding on you to do more.
Maybe that's the key. Thank you. I appreciate it.
That's great. Well, Danny, thanks again. Just from me, thanks for being here. I would just encourage all of you to pick up a copy of the book, and because part of it is, even if you've just got this small inkling that you feel like God may be calling you to something, but it's just the tiniest little thing, it's these kind of resources that He can use to blossom that in your life. And so would definitely encourage you to do that. Get in touch with Danny. And I sure appreciate all of you watching. We're so thankful for the way that you continue to watch and share and comment. And, we're thrilled to have you here with us on Missions Talk. So thanks again. Sure hope all is well with you all. And we'll look forward to having you with us on the next episode.